If one were to read the paper, Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system, by the originator of Bitcoin, Satoshi Nakamoto, it becomes immediately and immensely clear that Bitcoin was never intended to replace any currency, let alone become a new world currency reserve. The goal of Bitcoin, according to Nakamoto's paper, was to eliminate the need for financial institutions. Functionally, one would not be incorrect to simplify it as merely a BitTorrent solely for the exchange of money instead of media. Ironically, this has backfired given that instead of replacing financial institutions, speculative trading of cryptocurrencies has only made our modern-day merchants wealthier. The paper demonstrates that Bitcoin is not money but rather a digital commodity that has value but no value added. We show that both the production of and the speculation with Bitcoin draw from the existing global pool of value added. By extending the classical political economy approach and the new interpretation of the labor theory of value to the domain of digital commodities, the paper argues that Bitcoin mining is an automated reproduction process that requires no direct, living, labor and thus creates no new value. Bitcoin, in this regard, is not digital gold. Between sectors, Bitcoin mining redistributes wealth and value added already in existence, while Bitcoin miners with more computational power compete to appropriate the mining profits within the blockchain. The Bitcoin blockchain then creates rivalry in both the ownership and the use of the digital commodity through non-legal means. Our approach can be further expanded to the larger domain of automated digital commodities that are reproducible without the expenditure of direct, living labor.
As time passes, various extreme liberal economic ideas are taken up by leftists and promoted as progressive. I remember during the 90s, there were some people who claimed to be left-righters or even members of the Marxist political economy discussion group online who adopted Hayekian ideas in defense of the market economy. In the last 5 years, I've seen people claiming that Bitcoin or blockchain are going to be the answers to problems of socialist economics. Now, when you are criticizing people, it's best at first to make charitable assumptions. Here I'm going to assume, initially, that as its advocates contend, Bitcoin is actually a form of money. Of course, in practice it isn't. But if it were, that is why Bitcoin could provide no socialist answer to the problems of capitalist economy. So I'm going to go back to absolute basics. I'm going back to the circuit of commodities, something which Marx denoted by the sequence CMC. Now, what did this mean? Just a bit of revision here. Here's Yetunde with her goat. At this stage, the goat is just a use value to her, potential source of milk or of meat. She visits the market, so the goat becomes a commodity. She sells it, so she now has money. So we have the first transit that Marx describes. Commodity to money, C to M. But she now spends her money on a blue cloth wrap and a dire, and her second commodity now, which becomes a use value to her. So we've had a circuit, C to M to C, from goat to money to cloth wrap. And we call it a circuit because it started with a commodity and it ends with a commodity. But, as Marx said, this is already potentially unstable. He said that this simplest form of commodity circulation already contains the germ of all future capitalist crises. Now, it's not evident, but look what he says. Suppose instead of spending her coins, Yetunde chose to put her coins in a pot, in a hoard, and save them up. What happens then? Well, Damalola now can't sell her cloth, so commodity circulation is interrupted. And this happens in every capitalist crisis. At one time, people did store their money in pots. Archaeologists uncover hoards from year to year, full of old coins that people had stored in pottery pots. With time, money that was once stored in pots gets stored in banks. Giant firms now hold bank deposits rather than buying commodities. If they think it's more profitable in the short term to leave their money in the bank, they do so, and a recession follows. And if banks were replaced simply by Bitcoin wallets, the same could occur. Firms, when they thought it unprofitable to invest, would hold their value as money, and that would interrupt the circulation of commodities. Now, what would happen if Bitcoin did become legal tender, as its advocates wish? Well, if you look back to the period of the gold standard, we get an indication. During the period of the gold standard, you had non-fiat money, but you still had commercial crises. You had the Great Depressions of the 1870s and 1930s. Consider what would happen if all mortgages in the US over the last 10 years had been taken out in Bitcoin. It's clear that almost all homeowners would have been ruined as the Bitcoin value rose. The Bitcoin value would be far above their potential income and their ability to pay it. But we saw something like that before. We saw it both at the end of the 19th century in the United States, and we saw it in the 1930s, when there was mass foreclosure on farm mortgages. Mass foreclosure because the mortgages were reckoned in what was essentially a gold standard. And when commodity prices were falling relative to gold, the value of the mortgage that you owed to the bank went up. This would be even more extreme with Bitcoin. The tendency of firms to hold back from investment will be even more extreme, because holding their assets as money, as Bitcoin, would pay more than purchasing means of production which were depreciating. You would get mass dispossession, as was seen in the 1930s, except it wouldn't be just dispossession of farmers, it would be people being thrown out of their houses on a mass scale. Contrary to what the advocates of Bitcoin claim, were it to become legal tender, the control of the banks, of finance capital, would be re-established in the most vicious way possible. Debts would become debts that were measured in an appreciating asset, which no one could hope to pay back. And in the end, the banks would own everything.
Professor, you're an expert in this financial world and technology. So in your opinion, is this perhaps a template for how things might be evolved in the future, or is it, what do you think about this as a kind of starting point?
Bitcoin doesn't quite work as a new global currency for a number of reasons. Firstly, there's the size of the blockchain. Secondly, there's the delay. A reasonable delay to get a transaction booked in might be about an hour, because you have to wait for more than one hash to be sure that the transaction has gone through and it's final. A third problem is the lack of recourse. If something goes wrong, there's nobody to phone. A fourth problem is that over time, as the amount of money available to miners goes down, so the willingness of people to do Bitcoin mining might go down, and the system is certainly going to have to change. It may even face a crisis if it's no longer possible for people to borrow money from their bank in order to buy Bitcoin mining equipment, which is already beginning to be the case. So for a number of technical reasons, Bitcoin was a good first try at building something, but we don't really know what its successor is going to be really good at. And to my way of thinking, Bitcoin is a wonderful technology waiting for somebody to invent its true killer application.
Thinking of criminal activity, etc., if you can see where all the transactions came from and went to, is that not a paper trail for the authorities?
Bitcoin and crime is a fascinating topic because one of the things people did with Bitcoin was to set up online underground marketplaces. So the most famous of these was Silk Road, which was set up by a guy called Ross Ulbricht, who got nicked a couple of years ago. And his idea was that you could use Bitcoin for buying and selling drugs online by mail order. And criminologists are divided over whether this was a good thing or a bad thing. Most of the people doing the buying and selling seemed to be low-level drug dealers. And it seemed to diminish the amount of street criminality, the number of people carrying guns around, if they could buy and sell stuff by post, rather than having to meet in dark corners and be terrified that they would be shot by the counterparty. So how that basically worked was that you did a transaction in return for Bitcoin, and the operator of Silk Road, Ross Ulbricht, would keep a proportion of the money, and in fact he would keep all the money until good delivery had been signaled by the purchaser. And this really annoyed the FBI, so they tracked him down and they arrested him in a library in San Francisco, and he's now facing a very, very long period in jail. Since then, other people have set up similar enterprises. The problem with Bitcoin for this purpose is that everybody can see which transaction led to which other transaction. Now, some people have tried to set up Bitcoin laundries where you get in hundreds of Bitcoins and you put them then through a series of transactions, wash, spin, and repeat, as they're divided up into smaller Bitcoins, transacted between each other, and then amalgamated again. But since this is all public, you can write scripts that will simply parse that and identify a laundry, and then identify the inputs and the outputs. And we have had some fascinating papers at the Financial Cryptography Conference, which, for example, pointed out that the FBI didn't manage to identify all of Ross Ulbricht's Bitcoins, and they found millions of dollars of other assets that were clearly his from the pattern of transactions. Another thing that you can do is you can identify bad people because of particular bad transactions that they did. One of the things that Ulbricht was accused of was trying to arrange an assassination of a rival, and you can look in the Bitcoin blockchain and you can see the sum that was supposedly paid to the hitman. Of more concern to us nowadays is ransomware, because since Bitcoin has come along, we've seen a type of malware where your PC gets infected, it encrypts the hard disk, and it sends you a message saying, please pay us 5 Bitcoins within the next 5 days, or you can say goodbye to your data. So you then have to go to a Bitcoin exchange and buy the Bitcoins and learn how to operate them and so on, and send to these villains. And they will then send you a key with which you can decrypt your hard disk. Now, an interesting thing from our point of view is that when we look at the blockchain, it's fairly easy to spot bad transactions. So if I ask you for a ransom, I'll probably ask for 5 Bitcoin or 10 Bitcoin or whatever, depending on what I think I can shake you down for. But if I'm selling you a camera, it might be for 0.3076 Bitcoin, right? It's a long decimal fraction. And so in this way, you can easily do a triage between transactions that are probably genuine and transactions that are quite possibly suspicious.